cities across Brazil have been hit hard by a recent surge in COVID-19, fuelled in part by a new contagious variant of the virus. For the sixth month in a row, the city of Rio de Janeiro has seen more deaths than births. Earlier, I spoke with the journalist and author Glenn Greenwald, who's on the ground in Rio. Glenn, appreciate your time. Take us through just how dire the COVID situation is there on the ground.
I think it's really hard to overstate. Basically, I know after a year and a month or so of the pandemic, people are kind of exhausted hearing horror stories. But what's going on in Brazil, I think, is unlike anywhere else. There were some really gruesome stories a month or two ago where people were actually dying because hospitals lacked oxygen. And the latest horrors are that people are dying because they are being intubated without sedatives because there's a sedative shortage. And it all stems from not just the government's failure to manage the pandemic, but also this variant that spread so rapidly and that evidence is starting increasingly to show is actually more lethal and more aggressive in terms of how it attacks the system. And this is already a health system that was overburdened, where poor people had very little access to meaningful health care. And now with the pandemic on top of it all, the death toll is, I think it's 1 in 3 or 1 out of every 4 deaths on the planet now is in Brazil.
And how is the vaccine rollout progressing? Is that offering any light at the end of the tunnel?
The vaccine is finally being made available. But just to give you a kind of anecdote, I think everyone I know practically in the United States is fully vaccinated, no matter their age, whereas almost everybody that I know in Brazil is not. I think they're down to about 63 or 64, the age group. So everybody below 64 is still unvaccinated. The older population is finally now getting vaccinated, but it'll be months and months before the vaccine is available to people in their 40s or mid-30s. And at the moment, a lot of people in intensive care are actually under 40. So it's becoming an increasing problem, even from the perspective of age.
You alluded to the fact that the government's been accused of bungling the country's response to the pandemic. How would you describe the leadership in particular of the president on this issue?
Well, at first, what President Bolsonaro was doing is very similar to what President Trump was doing, what Prime Minister Johnson was doing, which is downplaying the virus, making light of it, claiming it was nothing more than like a flu. And unlike pretty much every leader in the world who began by doing that and quickly realized that that was reckless and irresponsible, especially Boris Johnson when he almost died from it after he contracted the virus, and even President Trump, who, to his credit, got these vaccines ready and available and a plan to distribute them around the world, around the country, President Bolsonaro continues to be in denial, saying there's no reason to even have the vaccine, it's not worth the money to buy it, encouraging people to continue to leave their houses, even with this variant spreading. He's mocked it. He's made light of it. He said, everyone's going to die eventually. We can't shut down the economy. That's just been his attitude from the start, and it's never really changed. He's gone through 4 health ministers, 4 in the last year, because each one has been increasingly unwilling to stay on board with his deceitful messaging. And so it's just created chaos on top of this kind of deliberate indifference on the part of the government.
So when you say that he's encouraging people to leave their homes, what is the sense of restrictions, if any, in Brazil in the face of what is clearly a crisis?
Well, one of the things that has happened is that the state governments ended up being at war with the federal government. Even right-wing governors who had been allies with President Bolsonaro looked around and saw the severity of the pandemic and started imposing serious lockdowns and quarantines. The problem is that where you have a country where so much of the population is in desperate poverty, you can only lock down for so long if you don't continue to pay them monthly payments to stay at home. And those payments have now expired. So a lot of people are faced with that, kind of impossible choice of staying at home and not being able to feed their family, or going out onto the street and contracting a lethal virus and bringing it back to their family. And so what you see increasingly is subways full, metros full, even as this variant is spreading, and a government encouraging them to do that, while you have governors and mayors trying to tell them the opposite. And this mixed messaging has really created a lot of confusion.
Yeah, it certainly sounds like a clear failure of leadership on that national level. I know your book, Securing Democracy, chronicles how you exposed Bolsonaro and others for colluding with the courts to send opponents to prison, helping Bolsonaro win the presidency. What does that whole episode teach us about Brazilian politics and about the president himself?
Well, even before the pandemic, there was obviously serious political concerns once Bolsonaro was elected, because he's somebody who has spent the last 30 years as a congressman explicitly arguing that Brazil was better off under the military dictatorship that ruled Brazil from 1964, when there was a military coup engineered by the CIA with right-wing Brazilian generals, until 1985, when Brazil redemocratized. And it was a really brutal dictatorship. It imprisoned journalists, killed dissidents, exiled artists. There were no civic rights of any kind. And when you have a president ushered in to power on an explicit pledge to bring back those repressive measures, there's obviously a lot of concern. And our reporting that we began doing about 4 or 5 months after he was inaugurated kind of ran headlong into those promises about whether Brazil was going to continue to be a democratic country that protected basic guarantees under the Constitution.
It sounds like a dangerous environment to be a journalist in. Did you take a lot of risks to break those stories? Just how dangerous is it to actually challenge the president?
Yeah, Brazil is, obviously a country where there's been a lot of political violence for many years. People who run for office, who are elected to office, are killed routinely. The Bolsonaro government has been linked to some of the most violent paramilitary gangs in the country. And our reporting was aimed at one of the most important ministers in the Bolsonaro government, this former judge who actually sentenced former President Lula da Silva to prison as he was getting ready to run in 2018 against Bolsonaro. And that conviction resulted in barring him from the race. And so this reporting became very destabilizing to the government. We were deluged with death threats whenever I went and made public appearances. Extreme security measures were required. We got a lot of events canceled. And then ultimately, the reporting did conclude with the Bolsonaro government, as President Bolsonaro had repeatedly threatened to do, trying to imprison me by bringing criminal charges against me along with my source. And the court threw those charges out only because the Brazilian Supreme Court had intervened and barred the Brazilian government, the Bolsonaro government, from retaliating against me for my journalism. But they certainly tried everything they could to put a stop to the journalism.
Glenn Greenwald, appreciate you taking the time to speak with us. Thank you so much.
Yeah, thank you for having me. Really appreciate it.